High above the Pacific Ocean in 1943, American bomber crews were dying at a horrifying rate that nobody could explain. Young men barely old enough to vote were climbing into their aircraft each morning knowing that many of them would never return, and the terrifying part was that enemy fighters were not always to blame. Something else was killing these pilots, something invisible and unstoppable that struck without warning in the middle of seemingly routine flights. Commanders watched helplessly as plane after plane spiraled into the ocean or exploded in mid-air, and no amount of courage or skill seemed to make any difference. The losses were so catastrophic that some military leaders began to whisper that certain aircraft models might be cursed or fundamentally flawed. Families back home received telegram after telegram bearing the worst possible news, and the War Department knew they were running out of time to solve this deadly puzzle. Then one man with a camera and an idea created something that would change everything overnight. A simple training film that would save thousands of lives and transform how the military taught its warriors to survive. The United States entered World War II with tremendous industrial might and patriotic enthusiasm. But enthusiasm alone could not keep aircraft in the sky or bring pilots home safely. By the middle of 1943, the Army Air Forces faced a crisis that threatened to undermine the entire war effort in both Europe and the Pacific. Bomber crews were experiencing catastrophic loss rates that exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions. And while enemy action certainly accounted for many casualties, a disturbing pattern began to emerge in the accident reports. Planes were crashing during training flights over American soil. Experienced pilots were making fatal errors in combat that seemed completely avoidable, and crews were dying from mistakes that should never have happened in the first place. The statistics painted a grim picture that kept generals awake at night. For every aircraft lost to enemy fire, another seemed to vanish due to pilot error, mechanical misunderstanding, or simple confusion about proper procedures. The problem went far beyond individual mistakes or isolated incidents of bad luck. The rapid expansion of the Air Forces meant that thousands of new pilots were being rushed through training programs that could not possibly teach them everything they needed to know. Young men who had never seen an airplane up close 6 months earlier were suddenly expected to master complex four-engine bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress or the B-24 Liberator. These machines were technological marvels packed with complicated systems, multiple engines, retractable landing gear, hydraulic controls, and dozens of instruments that all required careful monitoring. A single mistake in the air could doom an entire crew, and there were so many ways to make mistakes. Pilots might mismanage their fuel mixture and cause engines to fail, or they might ignore warning signs of mechanical trouble until it was too late to recover. Some crews died because they did not understand how to handle emergencies that veteran pilots knew how to survive, while others perished because nobody had properly explained the dangers that awaited them in combat conditions. Military leaders recognized that something had to change, but finding the right solution proved incredibly difficult. Traditional training methods relied heavily on classroom instruction, technical manuals, and hands-on practice with instructors, but these approaches had serious limitations. Technical manuals were dense and boring, filled with engineering jargon that confused more than it clarified. Classroom lectures could only convey so much information before students stopped paying attention, and many young recruits struggled to connect abstract concepts discussed in a classroom with the real-world situations they would face in the cockpit. Hands-on training with instructors was valuable but expensive and time-consuming, and there were never enough experienced instructors to go around. The military needed a way to reach thousands of pilots simultaneously with information that would actually stick in their minds and change their behavior when it mattered most. Some officers suggested creating better written materials or establishing longer training programs, but these ideas faced immediate practical objections. The war could not wait for perfect solutions, and every day spent developing new curriculum was another day that poorly prepared crews flew into danger. Others proposed assigning more instructors to training bases, but experienced pilots were desperately needed in combat units, and pulling them back for training duty meant weakening the fighting force. The challenge seemed almost impossible to solve. How could the military quickly and effectively teach complex life-saving information to thousands of young men who were already overwhelmed with everything they needed to learn? The answer would come from an unexpected source, not from the ranks of generals or training experts, but from the world of Hollywood entertainment. The United States military had already discovered the power of motion pictures for training purposes earlier in the war, and several talented Hollywood directors had enlisted or been recruited to create educational films for the armed forces. Among these filmmakers was a dedicated group working for the 1st Motion Picture Unit, a special organization that combined military necessity with cinematic creativity. These directors, writers, and cameramen understood something that traditional military instructors did not. They knew that people remember stories far better than they remember lists of facts, and they understood how to use emotion, drama, and visual imagery to make information unforgettable. While military manuals put people to sleep, a well-made film could grab attention and hold it, burning important lessons into the minds of viewers through the power of storytelling and realistic demonstration. The idea emerged to create a training film, unlike anything the military had produced before. A film that would focus specifically on the common mistakes that were killing pilots and show in graphic, undeniable detail exactly what happened when crews made those mistakes. This film would not be a dry recitation of procedures or a boring lecture about aircraft systems. Instead, it would be a dramatic, visceral demonstration of real accidents reconstructed with actual aircraft and real footage from combat situations. The filmmakers would show pilots exactly what they needed to fear and exactly how to avoid those dangers, using the emotional impact of seeing crashes and explosions to drive the lessons home in a way that no textbook ever could. The goal was to create something so powerful and memorable that every pilot who watched it would carry those lessons with them into the cockpit and remember them in the critical moments when memory could mean the difference between life and death. The team behind this revolutionary training film began their work by studying hundreds of accident reports, interviewing survivors, and consulting with experienced combat pilots about the most common and deadly mistakes they had witnessed. What they discovered was both shocking and frustrating. Many pilots were dying from errors that could easily be prevented if only someone had properly explained the danger to them beforehand. Some crews failed to check their fuel levels carefully and ran out of gas before reaching safety. Others ignored warning signs of engine trouble until catastrophic failure occurred. Many pilots did not understand the proper procedures for emergency situations like engine fires or hydraulic failures, and they made panic-driven decisions that sealed their fate when calm, correct action could have saved them. Perhaps most tragically, some aviators died because they simply did not know what they did not know, flying into dangerous situations without realizing the risk until it was too late to escape. The filmmakers decided to focus their message on one particular aircraft that was causing enormous concern among Air Force commanders. The B-25 Mitchell was a medium bomber that served with distinction throughout the war, but it had characteristics that could be deadly for inexperienced pilots who did not understand how to handle it properly. This aircraft would become the star of the training film, and every mistake, every danger, and every life-saving procedure would be demonstrated using actual B-25 bombers. The production team worked closely with test pilots and aircraft engineers to recreate common accident scenarios in controlled conditions where cameras could capture exactly what happened. They filmed engines catching fire, landing gear failing to extend, and emergency procedures being executed correctly. They used real footage from actual accidents where available, showing the terrifying reality of what happened when pilots made critical errors. The goal was to make the danger feel absolutely real and immediate, to make every viewer understand in their gut that these disasters could happen to them if they were not careful. The training film that emerged from this intensive production effort was called Warning Red, and it represented a breakthrough in military education. From its opening moments, the film grabbed attention with dramatic footage of aircraft accidents and near disasters, immediately making clear that this was not going to be another boring training lecture. A narrator spoke directly to the audience in plain, urgent language that treated viewers like intelligent adults whose lives were in danger. There were no condescending explanations or overly technical jargon, just clear descriptions of what pilots needed to know and why it mattered. The film moved quickly from one scenario to another, demonstrating common mistakes and then showing the correct procedures that could prevent disaster. Each segment built tension and released it, keeping viewers engaged through the emotional power of seeing danger avoided or consequences suffered. One particularly powerful section of the film focused on the dangers of improper engine management during takeoff and landing. The narrator explained how pilots sometimes became distracted during these critical phases of flight and failed to monitor their engine instruments carefully. The film then showed actual footage of what happened when an engine failed during takeoff with the aircraft still low and slow. Viewers watched in horror as the bomber began to roll and yaw uncontrollably, the pilot fighting desperately to maintain control with insufficient altitude to recover. The crash that followed was shown without censorship or sanitization, making brutally clear what happened to crews who made this mistake. Then the film immediately showed the correct procedure, demonstrating how proper engine management and quick, correct reactions to engine failure could allow a skilled pilot to safely abort the takeoff or continue flying on remaining engines. The contrast between disaster and survival was stark and unforgettable, exactly as the filmmakers intended. What made this training film so revolutionary was its unflinching commitment to showing the truth about what happened when things went wrong. Previous training materials had often glossed over the gruesome reality of aircraft accidents, perhaps out of concern for morale or good taste, but the creators of this film understood that sugar-coating danger actually cost lives. Young pilots needed to be shocked and frightened into taking their training seriously, and they needed to see with their own eyes what would happen if they failed to follow correct procedures. The film showed aircraft exploding on impact with the ground. It showed planes cartwheeling across runways in showers of sparks and debris, and it showed the crumpled wreckage that remained after crashes. These images were disturbing and difficult to watch, but they served a vital purpose. They made the consequences of mistakes feel real and personal, transforming abstract dangers discussed in manuals into concrete nightmares that no viewer could forget. The film also demonstrated positive examples with equal visual power, showing experienced pilots handling emergencies with calm precision and bringing damaged aircraft home safely. These sequences were just as important as the crash footage, because they proved that survival was possible for pilots who knew what to do and remained composed under pressure. The narrator emphasized again and again that the difference between life and death often came down to knowledge and training, not luck or inherent ability. Any pilot could learn these procedures, and any pilot could survive if they paid attention and remembered their training when crisis struck. This message of empowerment balanced the fear induced by the crash footage, giving viewers confidence that they could master these challenges rather than feeling helplessly doomed. When the training film was finally completed and ready for distribution, military leaders arranged for it to be shown to bomber crews throughout the Army Air Forces. The screenings were mandatory, and pilots were ordered to watch carefully and take the lessons seriously. Nobody knew exactly what impact the film would have, but the creators and commanders hoped that it would at least reduce accident rates somewhat and save a few lives. What actually happened exceeded even the most optimistic predictions and shocked everyone involved. Within days of the first large-scale screenings, accident rates began to plummet across training bases and operational squadrons. Pilots who had just watched the film suddenly began catching mistakes before they became fatal, recognizing dangerous situations that they might have previously ignored, and executing emergency procedures correctly instead of panicking or guessing. The change happened so quickly that it seemed almost miraculous. Commanders who had been losing multiple aircraft per week to accidents suddenly found their squadrons flying safely day after day. Pilots reported that they could not get the images from the film out of their heads, and that when something went wrong during a flight, they immediately remembered the correct procedure demonstrated in the movie. Instructors noticed that students who had seen the film asked better questions and took their training more seriously, understanding that the boring procedures they were memorizing might someday save their lives. The film had accomplished something that thousands of pages of technical manuals and hundreds of hours of classroom instruction had failed to achieve. It had made the lessons stick in a way that actually changed behavior when it mattered most. Aviation safety experts who studied the dramatic reduction in accident rates after the film's release struggled to fully explain why it worked so much better than previous training methods. Part of the answer lay in the visual nature of film itself, which engaged multiple senses and created stronger memories than written or spoken words alone. When pilots saw an aircraft crashing in vivid detail, their brains encoded that information differently than if they had simply read about crash statistics in a report. The emotional response triggered by disturbing footage created a kind of psychological imprint that made the associated lessons much harder to forget. Fear, when properly channeled, could be an incredibly effective teacher, sharpening attention and burning information into long-term memory. The film's effectiveness also stemmed from its use of realistic scenarios that pilots could directly relate to their own experiences. Unlike abstract discussions of aerodynamic principles or mechanical theory, the film showed situations that looked exactly like the flights these young men were actually conducting. They recognized the aircraft, the airfields, the instruments, and the conditions, making it easy to imagine themselves in the cockpit facing the same challenges. This immediate relevance meant that pilots naturally connected the film's lessons to their own flying, thinking about what they would do if they encountered similar situations. The combination of emotional impact, visual memory, and practical relevance created a training tool far more powerful than anything that had come before. The success of this single training film had implications that reached far beyond bomber safety. Military leaders quickly recognized that the same approach could be applied to virtually every aspect of training across all branches of the armed forces. If a well-made film could reduce aircraft accidents overnight, then similar films could teach infantry tactics, naval procedures, weapons handling, and countless other vital skills. The First Motion Picture Unit and other military film production organizations suddenly found themselves in high demand, with requests pouring in for training films on every imaginable subject. The idea that Hollywood storytelling techniques could be combined with military necessity to create powerful educational tools became accepted doctrine, and the military invested heavily in expanding its film production capabilities. Other training films followed the template established by this groundbreaking bomber safety film, using dramatic recreations, actual footage, and emotional storytelling to teach everything from jungle survival to aircraft recognition to proper maintenance procedures. Some of these subsequent films achieved their own remarkable success in reducing casualties and improving performance, though few matched the overnight impact of the original. The broader lesson was clear. The military had discovered that the medium was just as important as the message, and that information presented in an engaging, memorable format could change behavior far more effectively than the same information delivered through traditional instruction. This insight would continue to influence military training for decades after World War II ended, and the principles discovered during this era remain relevant to educational theory and practice today. While statistics and policy discussions capture part of the story, the true measure of this training film's impact lies in the individual lives it saved. Each accident prevented meant a crew of young men who came home to their families, instead of dying in flames or drowning in cold ocean water. Every bomber that landed safely because its pilot remembered a lesson from the film represented not just military effectiveness but human tragedy avoided. Thousands of fathers got to meet their children, thousands of sons returned to their parents, and thousands of young men had the chance to live full lives after the war instead of becoming names on memorial walls. These human dimensions of the film's success are impossible to quantify precisely, but they represent its most important legacy. The pilots themselves understood what the film had done for them, and many wrote letters or gave interviews after the war expressing gratitude for the training that had saved their lives. Some described specific incidents where they had faced exactly the kind of emergency shown in the film, and had survived only because they remembered the correct procedure demonstrated on screen. Others talked about how the film had changed their entire attitude toward training, making them realize that every lesson and every procedure existed for a reason, and might someday mean the difference between survival and death. The film had given these young men the knowledge they needed to protect themselves, and it had delivered that knowledge in a way they could not forget even in moments of extreme stress and fear. Beyond its immediate impact on pilot survival, this training film represented a significant technical achievement in documentary and educational filmmaking. The production team had overcome enormous challenges to capture the footage they needed, coordinating with military units, arranging for aircraft and crews, and filming dangerous situations under controlled conditions. Some sequences required multiple takes and precise timing to capture the right angles and details. The editing process demanded careful attention to pacing and structure, ensuring that each segment flowed naturally into the next while maintaining tension and engagement throughout. The narration script had to strike a perfect balance between urgency and clarity, conveying complex information without becoming either too simplistic or too technical. The filmmakers also pioneered techniques for combining different types of footage into a coherent whole, mixing studio shots with actual combat footage, training exercises with reconstructed accidents, and close-up instrument details with wide shots of aircraft in flight. This sophisticated editing created a seamless viewing experience that felt authentic and immediate even though it drew from many different sources. The technical quality of the film was high enough that the sometimes disturbing content came across as genuine documentation rather than staged dramatization, even when scenes had been carefully planned and choreographed. This achievement in production value contributed significantly to the film's effectiveness, as viewers trusted what they were seeing and took the lessons seriously. The principles demonstrated by this World War II training film continued to influence military education long after the conflict ended. The United States Armed Forces maintained and expanded their film production capabilities throughout the Cold War era and beyond, creating thousands of training films on every conceivable military subject. Later generations of military films incorporated more sophisticated techniques including animation, computer graphics, and interactive elements, but they all owed a debt to the pioneering work done during World War II. The fundamental insight that visual storytelling could teach more effectively than traditional instruction remained constant across decades of technological change. Modern military training has evolved to include video games, virtual reality simulations, and computer-based learning systems, but these advanced tools still reflect the same core principles discovered during World War II. The goal remains to create engaging, memorable learning experiences that change behavior and improve performance under real-world conditions. The most effective modern training programs still use dramatic scenarios, emotional engagement, and realistic simulations to help service members understand dangers and master correct responses. Whether the medium is a 1940s training film or a 21st century virtual reality simulator, the underlying truth remains the same. People learn best when they are emotionally engaged, when they can visualize themselves in realistic situations, and when they understand exactly what is at stake if they fail to apply their training correctly. The success of military training films during World War II also influenced civilian education and safety training in the decades that followed. The same techniques that had saved pilot lives could be applied to teaching industrial safety, driver education, public health practices, and countless other areas where changing behavior could prevent accidents and save lives. Educational institutions and private companies began creating films modeled on the military's approach, using dramatic demonstrations and emotional appeals to make safety lessons memorable. Some of these civilian training films became cultural touchstones in their own right, shown to generations of students and workers, and becoming part of shared cultural memory. The broader recognition that film could be a powerful educational tool helped accelerate the development of educational television, instructional videos, and eventually online learning platforms. The transition from pure entertainment to educational content delivery through visual media owes much to the pioneering work done by military filmmakers during World War II. These early training films proved that audiences would pay attention to educational content if it was well made and engaging, and that visual media could convey complex information more effectively than traditional methods in many contexts. This lesson has become increasingly relevant in the digital age, where video content dominates online learning and information sharing. Despite the enormous impact of this training film and others like it, the people who created these potentially life-saving works often remain unknown and uncelebrated. History remembers the famous generals and the heroic combat pilots, but the screenwriters, directors, cameramen, and editors who produced training films rarely received recognition for their contributions to the war effort. These filmmakers worked under difficult conditions, often with limited resources and tight deadlines, to create materials that genuinely mattered for military success and personnel survival. Their creative talents were applied not to entertainment or personal glory, but to the unglamorous task of education, and their reward was knowing that their work might save lives even if their names were forgotten. The pilots and crews who flew in the training film productions also deserve recognition for their courage and skill. Deliberately recreating dangerous situations for the camera required precision flying and careful risk management, and these aviators put themselves in harm's way so that others could learn from documented near disasters without experiencing real ones. Test pilots who demonstrated emergency procedures on film had to execute those procedures perfectly while cameras captured every moment, performing difficult flying while also ensuring that the footage would be clear and useful for training purposes. The collaboration between filmmakers and aviators produced something greater than either group could have achieved alone, a perfect fusion of cinematic technique and aviation expertise in service of a vital mission. The story of how one training film reduced aircraft losses overnight during World War II holds important lessons for contemporary challenges in education, safety, and behavior change. The fundamental problem faced by the Army Air Forces in 1943 still exists in many forms today. Organizations and institutions constantly struggle with how to effectively teach critical information to large numbers of people in ways that will actually change their behavior when it matters. Modern challenges like workplace safety, public health compliance, cybersecurity awareness, and emergency preparedness all require convincing people to follow correct procedures even under stressful conditions, exactly the same challenge faced by military trainers during World War II. The success of the wartime training film suggests that the solution lies not in providing more information, but in providing information more effectively. People are not primarily rational actors who carefully weigh facts and make optimal decisions. They are emotional beings whose behavior is shaped by memory, fear, habit, and immediate context. Training and education that ignore these psychological realities will fail no matter how accurate or comprehensive the information presented. Effective training must engage emotions, create strong memories, show realistic scenarios, and make consequences feel real and personal. These principles apply whether the goal is teaching pilots to survive combat, convincing workers to follow safety procedures, or encouraging citizens to adopt healthy behaviors. One question that emerges from this story is why such an effective training method had not been developed and deployed earlier. The technology to create training films existed before World War II, and the military had already been using motion pictures for various purposes. The core insight that visual storytelling could teach more effectively than traditional methods seems obvious in retrospect. Why did it take a crisis of catastrophic accident rates to spur the creation of this revolutionary training tool? The answer likely involves institutional inertia, traditional thinking about how education should work, and the difficulty of recognizing when old methods are failing until the consequences become undeniable. Organizations often continue using familiar approaches long after better alternatives become available, simply because change requires effort and risk. The story also raises questions about how many lives might have been saved if this training innovation had been developed earlier in the war or even before the conflict began. Every pilot who died from a preventable mistake before the training film existed represents a tragedy that might have been avoided with better education. This sobering thought underscores the importance of constantly seeking better ways to teach critical skills, rather than assuming that traditional methods are good enough. Innovation in training and education can have life or death consequences, and organizations that fail to embrace more effective teaching methods may be needlessly sacrificing the people they are supposed to protect. In the vast sweep of World War II history, a single training film might seem like a minor footnote compared to the great battles, strategic decisions, and technological breakthroughs that shaped the conflict. Yet this one film achieved something that few weapons or tactics could match. It saved thousands of lives almost overnight, reducing aircraft losses so dramatically that the change was immediately visible in accident statistics across the entire Army Air Forces. The film accomplished this not through superior firepower or brilliant strategy, but through the simple act of teaching people what they needed to know in a way they could not forget. It proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is knowledge properly delivered, and that the right message in the right format at the right time can change everything. The legacy of this training film extends far beyond its immediate impact on bomber crew survival during World War II. It demonstrated principles of effective education that remain relevant today, and helped establish visual media as a powerful tool for teaching and behavior change. The film showed that engaging emotions and creating strong memories could accomplish what dry facts and boring lectures could not, and it proved that investing in better training methods could pay enormous dividends in improved performance and reduced casualties. Every subsequent training film, educational video, and interactive learning program owes something to the pioneering work done by those military filmmakers who decided that showing pilots the truth about danger was more important than protecting them from disturbing images. They understood that knowledge could be frightening, but that ignorance was far more deadly, and they had the courage to create something that shocked viewers into paying attention and remembering lessons that would save their lives. In the end, this simple training film became one of the most effective life-saving tools ever created, a testament to the power of communication, education, and human creativity applied to solving urgent problems. The young men who flew into danger after watching that film carried its lessons with them into the sky, and thousands of them came home alive because someone had cared enough to teach them properly what they needed to survive.